Hey y'all, Chris Sanders here, and in this standalone video from my Building Intrusion Detection Honeypots course, I want to give you a high-level IDH primer. So what I'll do here is give you a definition of intrusion detection honeypots, and then I'll talk through some examples. I'll give you an attack scenario where an intrusion detection honeypot would help the defender discover that an adversary is on the network. I'll talk through a couple of different characteristics and types of intrusion detection honeypot, and finally I'll end with a bit of a myth-busting section to really work through and talk through some of the misconceptions that often get applied to honeypots and really bracket out specifically the role of an intrusion detection honeypot and why it is incredibly effective and quite a bit different from the honeypots most people think of when they think about attack research honeypots. So with that said, let's get started. Let's consider a very typical attack scenario to begin with. In this case, we have an attacker and we have their target, and the attacker wants to access this potential victim, so they craft an email and send that to the victim. Of course, this is a phishing email. The victim either clicks a link in it or opens an attachment. It inevitably runs malware, and the attacker now has control over the victim's system. This gives the attacker a foothold onto your network, which they can now use to pivot to other systems that are available. Now, there are a number of ways that an attacker might do this, but one of the most common might be dumping credentials off the system, maybe running something like Mimikatz, doing some other type of technique that's operating system specific, getting credentials, and then trying to reuse those on other systems that exist on the network. Now, the attacker's going to have these credentials. They're going to maybe do some scanning, find some other evidence of other systems that they can access, and start logging into them, maybe installing some additional malware, some type of backdoor, something of that nature, and they'll eventually interact with and potentially even compromise all three of the systems that we have on the screen here. However, there's something that the attacker doesn't quite yet know. Computer 1 and Computer 3 here are perfectly legitimate systems that they've managed to compromise. Computer 2, on the other hand, well, it's not a legitimate system at all. It's actually a honeypot. It's actually a fake system we've set up to look like the other systems on the network and provide some form of meaningful interaction. The beauty of this is that it doesn't necessarily matter if the attacker was able to successfully authenticate to that computer, maybe even by simply viewing the login prompt and attempting to authenticate, or even simply by scanning it. We have an interaction point which we can then monitor and get alerts from and know that the attacker has done this. And this is essentially what we're doing with an intrusion detection honeypots. We're setting up a fake system, service, or even data in some cases that looks legitimate, that the attacker will think is real, but when they interact with it in any way, whether it's logging in, viewing a prompt, grabbing a banner, scanning over the network, anything like that, we are going to monitor for that and capture that interaction and know that that attacker is there. This is a lot more trivial than lots of other monitoring because the basic premise is that no one should ever communicate or talk to a honeypot because it does not serve legitimate business purposes. If someone does, we know that at best, it's a user who has strayed somewhere they shouldn't be, or at worst, it's an attacker who is on the network and trying to maybe move around it or expand their level of control. Either way, I want to know about both of those, and that is something an intrusion detection honeypot allows us to do. That brings us to a definition of an intrusion detection honeypot, which is fairly straightforward. An IDH is a security resource placed inside your network perimeter that generates alerts when probed, attacked, or compromised. A couple important things about this. First of all, we use the term security resource because it can really be anything. In the previous example, we talked about a system, but it can also be a service. It can also even be data. There are lots of great examples of using things like Word documents or PowerPoint documents or folders or even SQL records or commands run on systems as honeypots themselves. There's a lot of ways that you can go with this once you start opening your mind to thinking deceptively. There's also a little bit of nuance in terms of the interaction, right, between probing, attacking, or compromising. An attacker doesn't necessarily have to fully compromise a honeypot for you to know they're there. As a matter of fact, they generally have to do much less than that. As long as they scan it or maybe browse to it or attach to a service, we're going to know they're there. So simple probing is often enough, which means that these honeypots can often be incredibly simplistic in design and incredibly low interaction, which makes them very low maintenance. Ultimately, the most important concept surrounding intrusion detection honeypots is the idea that nobody should ever interact with a honeypot that is placed inside your network. If they do, it is an investigation-worthy event. Again, at best, it's a user has clicked on something they shouldn't have. Maybe they're exploring or made a mistake. We want to know about that so we can correct it. At worst, it's an attacker on the network, and now we can actually begin our investigation. And it doesn't matter if they eventually figure out it's a honeypot, because at that point, we already know that they are there. For them to know it's a honeypot, they will generally have to have interacted with that system, and that gives us a lot of power to take back our home field advantage and do some really neat things. Honeypots are defined by 4 primary characteristics. Honeypots are ultimately a form of deception. Intrusion detection honeypots repackage themselves as legitimate entities and often mimic a system or service. That might be a legitimate system or service in your network, or it could be something completely different from anything you have in your network. The whole goal here is to convey value to an attacker, and you can do that by blending in with other assets or standing out from them uniquely. And deploying different types of deception allows you to do that within the context of an IDH. Honeypots are also discoverable. We have to make it so that attackers can find honeypots so that they will eventually interact with them. For intrusion detection honeypots, something very unique about them is that they are placed inside the network and often very close to the assets they mimic. Remember, this is very different from attack research honeypots, which are placed outside the network or upstream from the firewall so that they'll collect scan data and things of that nature. These are very purpose-driven honeypots, and a best-case scenario, no one ever interacts with them, which means no one has probably ever compromised our network and discovered them. That's a great thing, but when these things fire alerts and when that interaction occurs, that means the attacker discovered a honeypot based upon their position in the network. And there's some cool things we can do by understanding our network. If we know where attackers are likely to show up on the network, we can take an approach where we place honeypots around that area. If we know what our targets are likely to be, where our sensitive assets and data are, we can place honeypots around that area. By knowing how attackers are likely to move through your network and arrive at it, you can place honeypots so that they are discoverable for those attackers and that they will eventually find them. Now, once we've created a honeypot that is deceptive and made it discoverable, it all comes down to interaction. And interaction basically says that an attacker needs to be able to do something with that honeypot. It needs to provide some sort of feature set to them. Now, that can be something very, very minimal. It can just provide a scan result. It can just say, hey, I've got port 22 open, or I've got port 3389 open. That's enough interaction that we can actually trigger on that and monitor it and know that that attacker is there. But we can also go a lot further than that as well. For instance, we can set up a fake SSH server that allows the attacker to actually log in with real credentials and issue commands. Of course, this isn't going to be a real SSH server. It's going to be emulating one. So we'll capture those commands and we'll gather that intelligence so we can better perform our investigation, but the attacker won't actually be able to do anything nefarious that would help them further their compromise or cause major damage to your network. We ultimately accomplish this by using low to medium interaction honeypots, things that have a very specific purpose. So generally speaking, we're not setting up, Windows XP from 15 years ago and leaving it vulnerable to attack. We do not need that level of interaction. We just need that initial scan or that initial connection or maybe even that initial authentication attempt to know that the attacker is on the network, and that's good enough for us. Now, once the attacker has interacted, all that's really left is to get a notification to us that that's happened, and that's where monitoring occurs. All intrusion detection honeypots are heavily monitored. Because they are not legitimate assets, there are not a ton of things or events that are going to be generated from them. You may have to filter out a few common network things like network scanners, for instance, or software inventory tools. Once you filter those out, the honeypot should generally be perfectly quiet all the time unless someone interacts with them. That's one of the beauties of intrusion detection honeypots is that they are very high efficacy. You're not going to get a lot of false positives from them. So you ultimately log everything on the honeypot either by using native operating system features or features of the purpose-built software that forms the honeypot, and then you pair that with some form of alerting that lets you know when someone interacts with the honeypot. Since this is high efficacy detection, you want that to be very high priority alerting. You either want it going to maybe email or text message or something like that if you don't have any type of broader log aggregation or SIM type software, or if you do and you have a queue-based system, you want it going to the top of the queue or your highest priority queue. That is generally the level of detection efficacy that intrusion detection honeypots warrant. I mentioned earlier that we don't necessarily constrain intrusion detection honeypots basically to just systems. As a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of exciting things you can do with honeypots, and those generally fall into three types or three categories that's worth briefly mentioning here. The first is probably the one you're most common with, and that's a honey system, which mimics the interaction of an operating system and all of the services it provides. So here we're talking about a full-blown deployment of Windows 10 or Red Hat Linux or even Cisco iOS or something more specific. We don't actually use these a lot in intrusion detection honeypots because they provide, while they provide a great deal more interaction, we don't need that level of interaction, and they're a lot more work to secure and make safe. We generally use more lower to medium interaction things like honey services. A honey service is a little bit more narrowly focused, and it mimics the interaction of a specific software or protocol function. For example, an FTP honeypot or honey service would maybe allow an attacker to authenticate and upload and download files. And you can certainly replicate this with actual FTP software, or you can replicate it with software designed to emulate FTP without actually providing the full range of service. So for instance, something that allows initial authentication but no actual upload or download of files, or maybe even only just upload. So if the attacker tries to upload something, you can grab that and see what it is. SSH is another common example of this. One of the most popular SSH honeypot tools is Cowrie, and it actually allows an attacker to log in as though this were actual real SSH and provides a fake file system for them to browse around with and commands to run. None of this is real. They can't actually leverage this to pivot to other services or do anything else more nefarious, but it allows you to collect a great deal of additional intelligence about what the attacker is trying to do on your environment and maybe what credentials they've stolen and are attempting to use to authenticate to things. So a honey service is simply that. You can use the real service, but in most cases we're going to try to use software that emulates the service to provide a specific function. And the attacker in many cases can eventually figure out that these services are fake, but at that point we already know they're there and the investigation can begin and we can get them out of our network, which is just excellent. Finally, and I think maybe the most exciting format of an intrusion detection honeypot is the honey token. And honey token simply mimics legitimate data. So for instance, Word documents, PDFs, or even SQL records. One of the most common examples of this, and I think probably the easiest way to get into honeypots, is the creation of honey documents. So for instance, an attacker is on your network and they've compromised a machine. One of the first things they're probably going to do is browse around and look for documents that may contain sensitive information or help them pivot to other systems. So if I have a document called passwords.xls sitting in my shared drive or documents folder, an attacker is certainly going to grab that and either they're going to open it right there or they're going to exfiltrate that off the network and then open it on their own system. What they don't know is passwords.xls is actually a honey document I've created. When they open it, it is actually seeing a URL for an image that is not visible and attempting to make a call out to a web server on the internet that I control. When that call out happens, I have configured it so that I will get an alert. I will know that someone has opened that document that is not real, that is illegitimate, that nobody should ever open, and I will be able to investigate that. Not only that, I will know where they opened it from. So I'll know if they opened it on one of my systems or on somewhere outside the network if it has been exfiltrated. So it gives me a little bit of intelligence to go on there as well. That's an incredibly powerful thing. You can do that with any sort of Office document, a Word document, PowerPoint, Excel. You can also do that with PDFs. And there are also a lot of other interesting versions of that you can pull off. For instance, making it so that if an attacker enumerates a specific SQL database, you can get an alert from that. Again, this is a SQL database record or table that should never actually be accessed because it provides no value. You can set up honey commands. So commands that when run on a system execute a token that notifies you that a command that should never ever be run is actually being run by an attacker, and there's some interesting things you can do there as well. So the sky is really the limit with what you can do with intrusion detection honeypots. There are a whole lot of different ways that you can go with them. Generally, we focus on honey services and honey tokens because there's a lot of flexibility there and it's lower interaction, but just the level of interaction we need without being a ton of effort. So the potentials are endless. I want to end this video by doing a little bit of IDH myth busting. One of the things I've found is that honeypots have been around for a long time, and there are a lot of misconceptions about what honeypots are and are not, and specifically what intrusion detection honeypots are and are not. And a lot of terminology and vocabulary gets conflated, and there are a lot of pre-existing notions that I end up having to fight a lot when I talk to people about IDH. So I've encapsulated at least a few of those here, so I want to go through those now. First of all, honeypots are only useful as a research tool. And that, of course, isn't true. Research honeypots are placed outside the firewall to collect malware and automated attacks. These are the sorts of honeypots that are generally used for research, but they're fundamentally different from intrusion detection honeypots, which are placed inside the firewall. Research honeypots sit outside the network. They just sit there. They're often intentionally vulnerable, or they're purpose built to catch specific types of scanning. So things like Blaster going way back, or WannaCry more specifically, and to track the proliferation of those various characteristics, or maybe build password lists from people trying to authenticate to certain systems, things like that. They have some degree of minimal intelligence value and can be used for specific focus types of research, but that's not the type of honeypot we're talking about here. Intrusion detection honeypots are specifically placed inside the network, very purpose built, and they only see any action if somebody's on your network and tries to interact with them, and that is when you are watching, and that is when they are monitored. So an intrusion detection honeypot is a very different paradigm from a research honeypot, which is what a lot of people are used to and have been very prolific in the past. The second myth, an attacker can compromise a honeypot and use it to real production host. Again, this isn't really true and is very unlikely. Intrusion detection honeypots are generally low to medium interaction. They're almost nearly always some type of purpose-built software with a very limited attack surface. And some of them are only just data or tokens. So it's something like a Word document or a record in a database, a set of credentials that maybe an attacker will use somewhere else and will monitor from those and when they were stolen from a honeypot. These are not intentionally vulnerable high-interaction operating systems. Again, we're not deploying 15-year-old Windows XP that is vulnerable to MS 08 067 out there and just waiting for someone to attack it. That would be a bad idea. We are building very specific, narrow, low interaction honeypots that don't give a lot of potential for this sort of thing to happen. These honeypots are software, and certainly software can be compromised, but in nearly every case, the software is also not running under high privilege itself. It's running as a local user because it doesn't often need a high privilege to run doing the things that it's going to be doing. So the worry that an attacker can compromise an intrusion detection honeypot and use it to pivot to real production host, generally unfounded. Not to mention that these are placed inside the network already. So if an attacker is interacting with them, they're already inside your network. They've already got some type of foothold. We're trying to detect those compromises before they become full-scale breaches and some type of very negative consequences suffered. The third myth I want to bust is that honeypots are complex and expensive to maintain. The truth is that most intrusion detection honeypots are a single piece of software or data that once set up requires virtually no maintenance. They literally just sit there and wait to be interacted with, and hopefully that never happens because hopefully that means you've never been compromised. But unfortunately, most of us will be at some point. So the hope here and the desire is that this will generally be a higher efficacy form of detection, and most intrusion detection honeypots generally are. Most intrusion detection honeypots are built with free and existing tools. The entire book I wrote about intrusion detection honeypots and the course that goes along with it are completely based on free open source tools. You don't have to spend any money on any software, just have to spend your time to set them up, which is also very minimal. There are commercial solutions available, and there's some of those that I think are actually very economical and affordable even for small businesses. So it's not like you're getting into some type of big enterprise contract akin to a SIM or a log management tool or a big signature-based IDS rollout. Honeypots for intrusion detection are generally very low cost to set up, create, maintain, and also to monitor, because they produce a very few amount of false positives and are very high efficacy, probably the most high efficacy form of detection you can set up on your network. The fourth myth I want to bust is that an attacker can easily figure out that these things are not honeypots. I've talked about this to quite an extent already. And first of all, I'll say that at that point, it doesn't matter. Nobody should ever interact with an intrusion detection honeypot that's placed inside your network. If they do, you'll get an alert and know the attacker is on your network, which is really the goal. That interaction can be very minimal, simply scanning a host, connecting to it, anything like that, and you know that they are there. There are very, very, very few circumstances in which an attacker would know it's a honeypot before interacting with it in some way. I think probably the most common is maybe they find a spreadsheet called honeypots.xls and it lists all your honeypots and they know not to connect to those systems or download that data. If you're smart, you probably make that document have some type of honeypot feature as well, and there's some cool things you can do there. But nonetheless, once an attacker interacts with your honeypot, you know they are there, and that's fine, because then you can investigate the compromise and kick them off the network rather quickly if you have all the necessary evidence sources available to you. And finally, the very last honeypot myth I want to bust. Very simple. I'm not ready for honeypots. I think a lot of people are afraid of honeypots for a lot of the reasons I've talked about. Hopefully I've dispelled many of those myths. But ultimately, from my view, both in theory and in practice, intrusion detection honeypots represent one of the highest efficacy forms of detection that are available to you today. They are one of the few detection solutions that scale down as well as they scale up, meaning they work incredibly effectively with low cost and low maintenance for small businesses. We don't have a lot of intrusion detection solutions that do that. Signature and anomaly-based IDS don't work very well for small businesses because of the amount of false positives and tuning they require. IDH, very little tuning. There's still a little bit with some types of them, but for the most part, it's very low amount of tuning, very low cost, very high efficacy. So at this point, now with the technology that's available and the techniques that are available, I'm of the belief that any detection strategy without some form of intrusion detection honeypot is incomplete. You are missing a critical part of your detection infrastructure. Not only that, I would say in many cases, you might start with IDH. For a small business, certainly you start with intrusion detection honeypots because of the value and low cost associated with it. For larger industries, I think you're deploying IDH alongside your initial signature-based intrusion detection capability. Maybe even before, but certainly not too long after. Given the effect and the value, it just makes the best sense. So, with that said, I hope this has helped clear some things up for you. I hope we've been able to bust a lot of the common myths associated with intrusion detection honeypots. Let's quickly wrap up and summarize everything we've talked about. First, an intrusion detection honeypot is a security resource placed inside your network perimeter that generates alerts when probed, attacked, or compromised. The basic premise of IDH is that nobody should ever talk to one. When they do, it's an alertable event that you want to know about. Intrusion detection honeypots work because they're deceptive, discoverable, interactive, and monitored, ultimately leading you to get an alert when someone interacts with one, which again, they should never do. An IDH can be a system, service, or token, although they're most often services and tokens, and they're generally very low interaction and purpose-built. Finally, intrusion detection honeypots are one of the highest efficacy, most cost-effective forms of intrusion detection available for network defenders. I hope you've enjoyed this video and this overview of intrusion detection honeypots. If you want to know more, be sure to check out my book, Intrusion Detection Honeypots, Detection Through Deception, or my online course, Building Intrusion Detection Honeypots.